Well, good morning and welcome. Thank you all for having me back. Really enjoyed our time in March, and hope everybody got their homework done and brought it with them to show me. I'm just kidding. Um, Honestly, I hope today's even more helpful. Last time we went through the homegoing process, and definitely a gift for those that you're going to leave behind to know what you want. But today we're going to talk about some biblical principles around how to leave your estate and who to leave it to. And I hope it's helpful and just thought-provoking. Let me open us in prayer real quick, and then we'll dive in. Heavenly Father, we thank you for who you are, Lord, God of the universe, creator of all things, creator of all wisdom. And we ask for your wisdom today as stewards of the resources you've provided us to provide for our needs, but then also to do good works and to provide for others in need. Lord, thank you for that responsibility. Pray for clarity in my presentation and that there'd be ears to hear your word and your principles. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Again, today we're going to talk about the wealth transfer process, and this is different from estate planning in that wealth transfer process starts right now, starts while we're living, and estate planning really takes effect at death. So I'm not going to talk about wills and trusts today. I'm going to refer you to some attorneys at the end that if you would like a good Christian attorney to work with on those. I work with 3 in particular that I think really highly of and do a great job and can be really helpful in that. But let's think about those decisions you have to make before you get to their office. So, yes, only about half of you in this room, based on statistics, have a will. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. But it's interesting that when we actually look at how much is being transferred, the average is only about 110,000 is the average inheritance. How long do you think it takes your heirs to spend that? The average is about 5 years, actually, that it takes for the inheritance to get spent. When you do your estate plan, it takes anywhere from typically 6 to 9 months on average, and that includes liquidating your property, distributing your estate, transferring retirement accounts, filing tax returns, completing court probate process. I've seen it take significantly longer depending on the complexity of the state. It can take upwards of 18 to 24 months at times, just depending on what's going on and what needs to be transferred and in what state, what asset type that needs to be transferred. Finally, probate is a public process. I think I mentioned that last time, whereas trusts are private. But regardless of how much you have, how many of you consider the transfer of wealth very important? Yeah, it's interesting that 77% of the silver generation, the 1925 to 1945, agree with you. They believe that responsibility is very important. Less than 50% of boomers share that same belief. How many of you believe that it's an obligation to transfer anything to your kids? Actually, interestingly, 21% of silver generation believe that it's necessary to transfer something to your kids. Only 3% of boomers. And yet, silver generation has about $12 trillion to transfer. The boomers have $40 trillion to transfer. That's just U.S. that's going to get transferred in the next couple of decades. The largest wealth transfer in history. So there are some risks of dying without a will, dying intestate. And this is just me prompting you to go do your will or do a trust, do something. If you die without a will, the state will write one for you. It creates a tangled mess and may cost significantly more in legal fees if you don't. And that's, I'm sure you guys have heard the story of people. The one that comes to mind recently is, usually musicians. I don't know why. Prince and who was the other one? Michael Jackson. Yeah, and when they die without a will, and it's just a massive disaster. So much fighting. Verbal agreements are neither legal nor binding, so if you tell somebody they get something, doesn't really count. It needs to be in writing. Your most recent signed will is the only valid one. And hiring an estate attorney may help preempt some of the disputes or misunderstandings. So you can go online and do a free will. There actually is a website called freewill.com. I love the name. Great play on words. And it happens to be a Christian site, so they get a chance to share a testimony or a scripture in there. But that's okay, depending on the size of your estate. But if there is any complexity to it at all, and you're concerned at all about the potential for conflict, then working with an estate attorney can help. That tangled mess to the Romans 14:19 comes to mind. Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. Washington State. So if you die in Washington without a will, and you're wondering where the assets go, first, if you're married and have no kids, yes?
Is any of this that you're telling us in this material?
Not yet. Yeah, we're going to pick that up later. If you guys would like a copy of this, I'll make sure that Lisa gets it, and make sure that it gets sent out to everybody here. Let's see, that one. Yep, there we go. So if you're married and have no kids, no parents, and no siblings, then your spouse will inherit everything. If you're married with spouse and kids, your spouse actually inherits your community property. That's what's acquired during marriage in the state of Washington. And half of your separate property from the inheritance, your kids would get the other half of any separate property that you had. Finally, if you're single, no kids, no living relatives, all your assets actually go to the state. Yeah. How many of you guys want them to go to Governor Inslee? No? None? I know he's looking for handouts. Even if you don't have kids and you don't want it to go to the estate, even having a will and leaving it to the church, or putting the church as a beneficiary, or a donor advised fund as a beneficiary is a great option. Yeah, do you have a question? Yeah. Correct. Yeah, you have the ability, whatever you bring into the marriage can remain as separate property. You can commingle that, and actually then it becomes community property. But if you leave it as separate property, it can remain separate. Yes?
If you bought a house and 3 weeks before you got married, but both on the thing and it's been refinanced a couple of times, kids are grown, is that community property?
It sounds like that's been commingled. It sounds like if both of your names are on the title and you...
Bought it together, both names on it?
Yeah, both of you have your names on the mortgage. Yeah, that sounds like it's community property. Yeah. There are some realities, harsh realities. We all eventually die. And I wanted to take a minute just to explain this photo. I wish it was a little larger. This was done by a client of our firm. He did a really neat photo book called Journeys with the Messiah. And he takes Jesus' parables and puts them in the setting of 2,000 years ago, but then adds a modern twist to it. So in this case, it's the family carrying the casket and money's pouring out of the casket as they're going down the road. We can't take it with us. As much as we'd like to, all this stuff we accumulate stays here and has to go to somebody else. We are probably going to die at a time other than we'd like. Sorry. We don't get to choose our time. Somebody else is going to get our stuff, and there's really only three places it's going to go: heirs, charity, or the government. You get to choose right now. If you don't do anything, you don't get to choose. So then how can, we can only decide before we die who gets our stuff after we die. Keep forgetting to hit those. So what stops you guys from taking action to do your estate plan? There's a few things that we've come across. Confusion is one of them. Who should you believe? There are a lot of people that'll give you advice on what to do with your estate, and it can be really confusing. Procrastination, I think I mentioned this last time, we tend to put off the important for the urgent. Complexity. Our estate plans today are most likely very different than they would have been 20 years ago. Lots of stuff has happened in the meantime. There are lots of options with, again, both wills and trusts, depending on the size and complexity of your estate. There's the risks of heirs misusing the inheritance. How do we know they're going to use it well? Here's another question for you. Do you leave it to your grandkids? Maybe, but you don't know them, and you don't know how if they're gonna be ready to be a steward of those resources. Our children's needs change. When they were 18, it's very different than when they're now 35 or 55. And as our children get older, we can see how their lives turn out and how they make decisions. How are they thinking differently about wealth today than they did 15, 20 years ago? There's another encouragement along those same lines. You can't complete an estate plan and just say it's done. If you've done a will and it's 15 or 20 years old, Jeff's not in the room, right? Yeah. Jeff admitted it. His is 15 years old. Well, he has grandkids now that he didn't have 15 years ago. His kids are in a very different place than they were 15 years ago. So estate planning is a process and requires is an ongoing process, and it requires a process. So that process is what you guys have on the table today. Another story, Ron Blue, the founder of Ronald Blue Trust, tells a story when he and his wife were starting to downsize, and their kids were grown and launched, and they were going from a big 5-bedroom house and 3-car garage and trying to get to something smaller that made more sense. And they went to their kids and said, "Kids, what would you like? You go through anything that you'd like, you can take." And they ended up with a giant pile of stuff to donate to Goodwill when the kids were done, because they wanted almost nothing from the house. So I've even actually had a situation where clients have a piece of property that was handed down to them. They think very, very highly of that property. Beautiful beachfront property up north. And we've gone separately to the kids to ask, because we've been working on their estate plan, do the kids want it? And the kids don't even want the property, interestingly enough. So as much as you think it's important, it may not be as important to the kids. So what's God's perspective on this, on all of this? First, I hope we can all agree, but not everybody does, that the Bible speaks authoritatively on every financial decision we will ever make. Sadly, 95% of Christians don't agree with that, and we think they do so at their peril. Again, God's word is the source of wisdom for his stewards of his resources. And it does say quite a lot. There are over 2,300 verses in the Bible related to money management, and wealth. So that's what we're going to spend the next little bit of time talking about. So God's way, what does that look like? We think it looks like an orderly wealth transfer process and that comes out of 1 Corinthians 14:33. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. In Matthew 5:42, therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But there's 3 fundamental questions that I want you guys to consider today. Who owns it? Yeah, Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. How much is enough? That's always a fun question when you think about your own situation. How much is enough for you? How much do you guys need? And we work with clients to actually help them set a finish line, to say, if you have this much and you have enough to meet all of your needs for the next however many years, and we plan for clients to live to 100. I know everybody I say that to says, gosh, I hope not. This hurts enough. But the reality is more of my clients are getting there. And so we don't want them to run out of money and want to make sure they have enough. So if they have enough, if they have more than enough, what's God want them to do with that? Maybe it's to give it to charity, more to charity. Maybe it's to give some to their kids now and start that transfer process now. How much is enough? The other part of that question, though, is one we're going to talk about in a minute. And it's when you ask it for the sake of your kids, how much is enough? Or how much is too much? There are some that would say giving anything to the kids is too much because they've just been really bad with money their whole lives. And yet you still feel the responsibility, that burden to help care for them. Well, maybe there's a better way to transfer that. Maybe it's in a trust and there's some controls on that. I'm working with a family right now, fairly well-to-do. They run a publishing company, a Christian publishing company, very prominent family. The brother, so first generation, I'd never met. They've since passed away. I'm working with the second generation, and one of the brothers is still running the company. His brother is an addict, a drug addict, and has been his whole life. And so they have a separate trust that provides for his needs, but a trustee that has the ability to drug test him if need be before they send a monthly stipend to him to meet his needs. So there's some creative ways to provide for kids without giving them control. Others, they may be ready. I was talking to Andy in the back as we were getting ready, and Andy shared that he and his family had the opportunity to buy a house, and his parents stepped up and said, hey, we have seen how much you guys had to sacrifice to be here in this community and serving God and allowing mom to stay at home with the kids, and some really, really hard choices. And they were so impressed with those choices that they said, hey, we want to gift you guys some funds for the down payment. And what a great way to bless the kids and then be a part of that blessing too, where now they get to go to the house and have them make dinner. The last question, fundamental question, is the next steward chosen and prepared? I'm not going to get into the preparation side of it this time around. We actually have a video on our website that's with Russ Crossan. Russ was the first employee hired by Ron Blue back in 1980. He's still working with the company 43 years later, and is now our chief mission officer. Vice chairman of the board. He does a great video on how to prepare your heirs to receive an inheritance. Encourage you to go check that out. All we do while living on earth has eternal consequences. Ecclesiastes 3:1, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. As I mentioned earlier, the advice we give to clients we serve is about the wealth transfer, which starts while they're living. Estate planning takes effect at death. A written wealth transfer process is about giving money and things to your kids without ruining their lives. The intent we hope is to enhance, not ruin heirs' lives. And an inheritance, we hope they think of it as a gift and not an expectation. Because that can lead to some really poor outcomes too. If the kids are expecting something that either they never get because you change your mind, or change your estate plan, or or the expectations were much greater than the reality. Maybe you don't have as much as they think you do, which I've run into as well. So there are 3 types of capital that we talk about with clients. We want to start this whole process with praying about how your gifts, bequests to the kids will impact your heirs, also their spouses, and then descendants, grandkids. The capital, financial capital, is the obvious. It's the assets that we have, the money we have in our bank account, in our investment account, in our homes, businesses, real estate investments. All of that stuff that provides for our needs. It's important. God provided it. And it's those assets that we're accumulating over our lifetime. The second one is social capital. This is going to be the relationships and influence we have with our family, our friends, and the broader community. Finally, our spiritual capital is our knowledge and faith of Jesus. Which one do you think is the most important in God's economy? What would be number 2? Yeah. How many times do we get that upside down when we think about passing our estate to our kids? How much time are we taking passing our values and our knowledge and love of God before they get the money? And again, just a challenge. This is not there's no judgment in the room. There's no criticism. This is a really hard process to go through, but just some things to think about. Russ Crossan, again, the first employee at Ron Blue, wrote a book called Your Life Well Spent. Fun play on words, in which he encourages readers to use their financial capital to buy up time to help our children build their social and spiritual capital, so that they are someday ready to be stewards of that financial capital. R.G. Letourneau, have you guys ever heard of Letourneau University? R.G. was a prolific inventor of massive equipment, big land-moving equipment. Highly successful businessman. Was actually referred to by his contemporaries as God's businessman. He took 90% of his salary and gave it away, along with company profits. And he learned to live on the 10%. Obviously, the 10% was a pretty big number for him too. But the idea is the same. He recognized that the question wasn't how much do I give away, but how much do I keep? And in his case, it was only 10%. He also was quoted as saying, "I'd rather give my kids to the world than my money to my kids." I'm going to say that one again. I'd rather give my kids to the world than my money to my kids. And so he did. He gave most of it away. One last funny quote. He said, well, God was shoveling it in, and I was shoveling it out. God just had a bigger shovel. Really quick, too, just as from perspective, attorneys see estate planning as all about protecting the financial capital. Again, I think I've made the point that God's also very concerned about our heirs, social and spiritual capital. So if we're working to pass along that foundation of social and spiritual capital before they get the financial capital, I think they'll do a better job of stewarding that. So I want to list out 5 principles, biblical principles, that we believe drive the wealth transfer process. The wisdom principle. Am I asking God for his wisdom when making decisions? James 1:5 says, if you lack wisdom, ask God, who gives generously to all who without finding fault, and it will be given to you. The unity principle. I know there's quite a few husbands and wives in the room. Husbands and wives, you need to be on the same page when you're working on your wealth transfer process. And this goes all the way back to Genesis. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. There needs to be unity. The giving while living principle. This was a famous Ron Blue one. Do your giving while you're living so you're knowing where it's going. And that's actually an interesting one with in Luke, the parable of the lost son. The younger son said to the father, Dad, give me my share of the property that's coming to me. And so he did. The father took the time and gave it to him. And we all know the outcome of that. But what a lesson that young man learned. The importance of family, the importance of coming back to his father. He wasted it. Do you think he wasted it the second time? If there was another inheritance? Probably not. Tools and principle. The tools principle. Estate planning tools and techniques help you accomplish objectives, but they're not the objective. And the KISS principle. Keep it simple. Thanks. Keep your estate matters as simple as possible. 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. We don't have to make them any more complex than they need to be. So finally, let's talk about this wealth transfer decision-making process. And here's where you can pull out your the handout that you picked up. So first, the transfer process. There's a few questions to consider here. What are the worst things that could happen to each of your heirs, each of the kids that you transfer money to? What's the probability of that? And how bad would that be? Ron tells a story. Ron Blue did a similar presentation to this, and he tells a story of a family that he was working with, and the son, actually this may have been his son-in-law, grew up very poor, but had a very strong work ethic, and had a very strong sense of responsibility that he was the breadwinner, that he was to take care of his wife. Well, what happens if the parents give him a giant inheritance and he's no longer the provider? What does his identity look like? Now, fast forward 20 years later, and he was president of the college, and now he had done plenty to take care of his family and was living into that responsibility. But we do need to be careful about how it impacts not just our kids, but their spouses too. Additionally, are your heirs content with their current circumstances? Are they generous with their own money? The treatment question, so this is going to be the next page. And again, I'm not going to go through all the individual questions. These are for you guys to take home and work on. But I think some great questions just to prompt some additional thought and conversation. The treatment, should you give the same amount to each kid? In addition, should you give the same asset to each child? We're working with another family that the dad was a business owner. Dad's passed away. He passed a pretty good chunk of the company to one son, but he has two other daughters. The one son has more than he'll ever need and really was already given his inheritance. So mom's now trying to figure out, how do I pass a similar amount? How do I treat them equally by passing something in a similar value to the daughters to provide for their needs? The son's not really happy, by the way. It's interesting. He's a little discontent with that outcome. But I love the line, love them equally, treat them uniquely. And I think that's what God does with each one of us. We don't all have the same amount of wealth in this room. God's treated each one of us uniquely based on how he's gifted us and what he had for us to do in this life. But he loves us the same. Number 3, the timing. When do you relinquish control? And to whom? Again, thinking about, should it go directly to the kids or should it be put in trust and have a trustee that oversees those? Again, sometimes that's really appropriate. If the child has a disability, there are special trusts that you can set up to protect and provide for that disabled child too. But the question really is, should you begin transferring some of those assets during your lifetime as a way to test and train them? Or just bless them, like in the case of Andy and his in-laws. The other side of this, though, is we've been talking a lot about during life. When we think about afterlife, don't try to control the assets after you pass away. Number one, you can't. It's really hard to do that well. And number two, I don't think you're really going to care when you're in heaven. Number four, transformation. So should you give the assets in the current form, or do they need to be transformed into something else? Is it a business and there aren't any heirs that are going to take over that business, so you need to sell the business before you pass away? We have quite a few. Again, one family in particular that I'm thinking about, that the dad, he wants to work till he dies. He loves what he does, and he can't imagine doing anything else. And not sure that he will. He'll probably still be sitting at his desk when he finally passes away. But that's, none of his kids are in the business. And is that the best thing for passing those assets on to the kids? Along those lines, because you can afford to help them, this is maybe back into the transfer decision. Because you can afford to help them, should you? It's a nice thought, but needs to be done without impacting their lifestyle. And some of the examples, Andy's example is a great one, where helping out the kids with a mortgage, paying off mortgage debt, helping kids or grandkids with education, medical bills where you can pay it directly to the hospital, can be a great way to help the kids without necessarily impacting their lifestyle, changing their lifestyle. The next one is the tools and techniques. It's fifth on the list because that's where it needs to be. We don't want to start with the tools and techniques. It's not about the wills and trusts first. It's about making sure you have clarity on all these other decisions before you go into the attorney's office and pay them $500 an hour to draft the will and to have these conversations with you. Most of them won't. Most of them won't have these conversations of asking that question. They'll generally ask, how much do you want to leave to the kids? How much do you want to leave to charity? They're not going to ask, is that the right amount? And that's what we want to have you guys spend some time doing before. And then finally, this is a really tough one for a lot of people, but talk to your kids about it. The worst thing is to leave them an inheritance that without actually explaining your desires for them, how you'd like to see them use those resources, your values and why you're giving them what you're leaving to them. Sometimes it's really simple. There's not a lot there, and you can make it as, again, keep it simple, but still talk to them about it. The other piece of that is making sure you're careful about giving to those future generations, the grandkids. I mentioned earlier, you don't know what their needs are going to be. You don't know how they make decisions. This family has been a great example. Now the third generation, two of the kids are doing pretty well. The third is a transgender. And I'm not sure that the grandparents would have thought that was a great idea to leave. Right now, there's a whole bunch that's skipping the second generation and going straight to the third generation to the tune of $2 to $3 million per child. And not sure that the grandparents would have been super happy with that. Again, I don't know that for a fact, but just be careful, is the lesson learned there. Hopefully, you're transferring assets to those that you actually have a relationship with. And they know the desires. You know their desires for wealth, and they know yours. So next steps. I do have some attorneys that we recommend. Tom Rada is in downtown Seattle, works with a firm called Ellis Lee McKinstry. We've done some work with them. I think they're going to be better on more complex states. They are a little more expensive. They're paying the high-rise rates down in downtown Seattle. But Christian, whole firms, believers, and they just do some really, really high-quality work. Ryan Reberg is another one, solid, godly man, and has a very successful estate planning, really focuses on estate planning. He does some other law too, but has built out a great team to serve folks here in the Northwest. He has 2 locations, actually, one in SeaTac and the other one in Bellevue. And then Nancy Cahill. Nancy's my attorney, actually. She does a great job. I love the fact that she allowed me to put a statement of faith in my will at the beginning, so that when my kids are hearing the will, they're getting to hear my love for Jesus as a start to that process of distributing the assets. And it's a great idea to include scripture, maybe your favorite scripture, or some kind of a testimony or statement of faith in your will or in the trusts. You also can do it yourself. There's U.S. legal forms, or I mentioned earlier, freewill.com is another one. And then if you want to do some more reading on the topic, a couple of great books. Whoops, backward, too much. Ron Blue wrote a book called Splitting Heirs that's been in circulation for a good long time, but it's most of, if not all of these principles came from that book. The other one is called Entrusted, and this is actually a planning firm that focuses on working with more ultra high net worth families that are passing on a pretty significant amount of wealth from generation to generation, and trying to think ahead at much more intentionally how do they prepare that next generation and then the future generations, and how do they bring them in to the business and make them a part of that decision-making process. Chick-fil-A, the Cathy family, has been clients of Ron Blue for a long time. And I love that they actually pulled together the whole family in a big board meeting. And everybody's involved in running the company. And there's a senior board and junior board, and the junior board's all the teenagers that are getting to actually have a chance to make decisions that are impacting the company. So it's some really cool ways that, creative, fun ways that families have figured out to do that. So next steps, review your current estate documents, figure out when the last time they were updated. This is not, again, meant to be a one-time, get it done, check the box and get it off your plate. This is a process, and it needs to be revisited every 5 to 7 years. That's typically about as much time as it takes for our lives or our kids' lives to change. So confirm that your wills are current and reflect your current wishes. Considering adding your favorite Bible verses to your estate documents I mentioned. Store copies in a secure place. Confirm your executor is still willing to serve in that role. And again, maybe even want to consider a corporate executor or trustee, and we can serve in that capacity for clients. It's one of the reasons we became a trust company, so that we could walk with future generations in providing that same biblical counsel for managing the wealth. And then consider a family meeting is that last step to discuss your estate plans. And again, the key here is prepare your heirs to receive God's resources through this inheritance. So I realize I just didn't take a breath, and I went through that really fast. But that is my presentation for today. I'd love some questions if you guys have any. Yes.
When your will is made in a different state, does it all have to be transferred to Washington?
Great question.
You have to get it.
Yeah.
You don't need to do that because you can't do it. No, I mean, is it only good then?
Yeah, the question is, should you, if you move from out of state into Washington or from Washington into another state, should you revise your will? And the short answer is yes. Every state has their own estate laws. And so you do want to make sure that especially if there's any kind of complexity to it, that you're addressing those unique estate laws for that state. Yeah, for instance, Washington state has, you have the ability to pass tax-free $2.2 million per person. If you go to Oregon, that's only $1 million that you can pass per person. And so then there may be some different things you need to build into that, those estate documents to make sure that's addressed. Yes?
Could you explain that per person? Although I know it's not Washington problem, but
Yeah. So the question is around per person. What are the estate exclusion amounts? And that relates to, and I actually went through this with a client recently whose parents, interestingly, had beautiful home they'd been in for a long, long time on Lake Sammamish. House ended up selling for a pretty significant amount. Lakefront property, and they ended up with a total of all of their assets of about $4 million. Their will was a simple will that said everything passes from husband to wife and wife to husband if they passed away. When the second spouse passes away, then their estate is the total of $4 million. The opportunity is, for the first spouse, is to set aside their portion of that net worth, set that aside in what we call a credit shelter trust, and that protects the amount that the first spouse has to exclude from their estate. The second spouse then has an additional 2.2 million. So each spouse gets the 2.2, but only if you allow for that within the estate documents to protect that amount from being lumped together for the second spouse's death. Yeah. The federal government, we don't really worry about right now with most clients because it's $12.5 million per person. So it's gotten pretty generous. We're still waiting for Washington to catch up, but yeah. Yes?
You mentioned that video at the beginning. How do we get to it?
Yeah, so ronblue.com is the website, and there's a section called library, and within the library there are a whole bunch of different stuff in there, but videos is one of those, and if you just search for heirs in the video section, that should get you there. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I think I answered it the last time I wasn't here. The difference, I guess, the question is, should we consider a will or a trust? And what's the difference?
Yeah, question is, should we consider a will or a trust? And it depends. There's a lot of things it depends on, but mostly the simplicity of passing the assets at death. A trust, you do the estate planning before you die, and the will gets transacted after you die. And that one, then the will goes through probate for any assets that aren't being transferred by beneficiary. Retirement accounts have a beneficiary. You can set up a beneficiary on an individual account called a transfer on death beneficiary. So those bypass the will, but anything else still has to go through probate. And that process, again, can be anywhere from as little as 6 to 9 months to as long as 18 to 24. Yeah, a couple of years. The cost is more for the trust up front, because again, you're doing all that estate planning before and trying to think of all the contingencies for what has to happen with those assets for the future generations. The will, the cost is really cheap up front, but then it's higher after you die because of that probate process. Yeah. Yeah.
my mother-in-law has a revocable trust written in Colorado. She recently moved to Washington State. Does that need to be advised?
Questions around if the revocable living trust in Colorado needs to be revised now that the mother-in-law's moved to Washington. That's a legal question. I'm going to have you call the attorney. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that. And I wouldn't want to steer you astray on that one. That one's important enough that it's probably worth at least consulting with an attorney and making sure that because, again, the Washington state law is going to be different than Oregon state law, and there may be some issues with that. Yeah.
Is it better to
Mm-hmm.
they have to pay tax on that.
Yep.
So isn't it better to have maybe part of that go to a charity to reduce the amount? Because they're gonna have to do, they're gonna have to take the money out of it.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question because that falls into my daily world. So the question's around, should you list a charity as beneficiary of the IRA? When we do estate planning, there's two types of taxes that we're thinking about, the estate tax, but also the income tax. And what you're referring to is the income tax side of it, where when your heirs get beneficiaries get to that retirement account, they still have to go pay income tax on that. And unfortunately, the laws changed fairly recently that says they have to take all of that money out within 10 years. So you can imagine if they're in a good paying job and now you're throwing an additional chunk onto them having to, as they take the money out each year to pay tax on that, then their income taxes may be fairly high. If you have a desire to pass anything along to charity, to give to charity through your estate, the IRA is the best vehicle for passing, the best asset to pass to charity, because the charity is going to receive those funds as beneficiary. They're not going to pay any tax on it. And so you're going to get 100% of that money is going to go to charity. For the kids, only 75% of those funds are actually going to get to the kids. The government's going to get the other portion. If they're living in Washington, if they're living in California, you get to add state income tax on top of that. So they get even less. A couple ways to do that really well on naming a beneficiary, a charitable beneficiary. There's organizations called donor-advised funds. Who's heard of a donor-advised fund in the room? Couple? Oh, I love it. Yes. Donor-advised funds are like your own little personal private foundation. But you don't have to run it. You don't have any tax reporting, and you don't have any legal reporting. You get to open an account. It's like a brokerage account, but it's money that you give to charity. And so the money goes into the account. You get a charitable deduction for that gift. And then from there, you get to the ability to grant that money out to charity. So we've been working with a group. We started 30 years ago. We started an organization called National Christian Foundation, and we wanted to, they were important enough, we actually spun them off and let them set it up as a separate organization. We've actually recently started another one called Blue Give, and bluegive.org, I think. And the fun part about those is that you only have to name one charity as beneficiary. And then, and that charity would be the donor advised fund. And so the money's from your estate, from your IRA, is going to go into that donor advised fund. You get to decide, or leave it up to your heirs to decide where that money gets granted out to. If you want to change a charity, if you change your mind and you decide, well, I don't want Canyon Hills to get it anymore, I want it North Creek to get the funds. You actually, if you want to do that, if you name the charity in your will or as beneficiary, you actually have to go change that legally, or go back to the brokerage firm and change the beneficiary. Whereas with this, you can just log into your account and change who the money gets transferred to after you pass away. So great tool for giving while you're living, because you can give you can give cash and just get one receipt at the end of the year, but you can also give appreciated assets. So that's, again, another one of those vehicles where if you wanted to give, let's say you have 100 shares of Microsoft and you paid $1 for it and it's worth $300 now. If you sell it, you're going to pay the capital gains on that $299. Then charity is going to get the rest. Government gets their first cut, charity gets the rest. The other option is to give the 100 shares to your donor advised fund and pay zero tax, and 100% of the value of those shares goes to the charity. So a fun way to do your giving. Yes?
What about the qualified charitable distribution?
Yeah, I love those too. So the question is around the QCD, Qualified Charitable Distribution, and that's where you can transfer money directly out of your IRA to charity, and it doesn't, you don't pay income tax on it. You also don't get a deduction. The benefit there is if your itemized deductions are less than the standard deduction, then you actually pay less in tax by giving directly out of your IRA to the charity. Those gifts can't go through a donor advised fund, but do have to go directly to the charity. But you can instruct, we work with Fidelity as our primary brokerage firm that transacts all of our custodies the accounts that we manage and does all the reporting for us. And with them, we can, it's almost like a bill pay. We just tell them where to send the check. Client signs the form that it's going to a third party, and then the client gets a receipt from that charity saying that they gifted, the charity received the gift on their behalf. Yes?
With these organizations, I think I just answered my own question, but let's go back with that, your shares of Microsoft.
Yeah.
That, so if I'm saying if you did that, that's after that, right? So that if, I told my students I was going to live to 125, and I'm
Yep.
going to meet them all, I don't plan on, but if for something happened and I ended up needing all my money because I really don't just care or something like that, so I still have access to those shares, that they're only getting it if they're still there after.
Yeah, you don't want it. So let me clarify, with the donor advised funds, those are great vehicles to name as a beneficiary for if you want to do charitable giving after death. For all your giving during life, so for the 100 shares of Microsoft, you would give that to them during your lifetime, because at your death, that's actually going to get a step up in cost basis anyway, and there isn't going to be the same taxable gain that there was today. So again, that's probably a little more complex, but a little more technical. But yeah, the donor advised funds are great for giving while you're living, giving appreciated assets, and then they're also great for that testamentary giving where you can just name one charity as the beneficiary and then manage who you want that to go through that website. Yes.
Couple of questions. Something you mentioned earlier about maintaining your heirs with an IRA account for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Withdrawn, so it's not liquidated immediately after your death. Is it
No.
like a RMD, like required minimum distribution per heir? Over a 10-year period?
Yeah, they have a little more flexibility than that. The question's around when your heirs receive the retirement account, they're a beneficiary of your IRA, and they're receiving the funds. It's actually going into an account with both your name and their name on it. The IRS wants to see that it originally was owned by you, and so there's a required minimum distribution that you have until you pass away. Once the money goes into the account, then they have a little flexibility on when they take that out. But the entire amount has to be taken out within 10 years. So it doesn't get liquidated in year one, thankfully. That's what we're trying to avoid at all costs. But they can, if they have the ability to manage it, if there are going to be years where they're going to have less income, and then it makes sense for them to take it out and pay less tax on it, then they have that flexibility to do that.
The second question is, how much can you gift your heirs or your children per year before they have to pay income tax? Yeah, before they have to pay income tax.
Yeah, the question's around how much can you give to your heirs each year? This year, if I remember right, it's $16,000 per person. They don't actually pay any income tax. You don't pay any income tax. You don't pay any estate tax. That gift is if you give them more than that, and it's per person. So if you give $16,000 to a son and a daughter-in-law, and there are 3 kids, you can give 5 times 16. So you can give $80,000 to them in a year without having to file a gift tax return and without any other implications for your estate. And it really is about how much your exclusion is. That $12.5 million that the federal government gives us is a lifetime exclusion. So if you give more than the allowable amount in any one year, then the government just wants you to count that against that lifetime exclusion. And so you're just going to use up a portion of that exclusion over time. Yeah, but thankfully no income tax when that happens. Yeah.
It's 17,000.
Is it 17 this year? Yeah, I knew I was going to get that wrong. Sorry.
Another question.
Yeah.
So I have an inherited IRA
Mm-hmm.
from my father.
Mm-hmm.
I inherited before the rules changed.
Yep.
So when I pass away, do they have to continue to take that distribution according to the original schedule? Or do they now take it out over the?
Yeah, I think they're subject. Yeah, you probably want to check with a CPA on this one, but that one's a little more technical question. But I believe they're going to be subject to the new laws, and then they would have to take it out within the 10 years. So the question was around if. I'm sorry, what's your name? Tom. Tom has an inherited IRA, and he received that before the rules changed, so he's grandfathered in, which is kind of nice. He just has to take a required minimum amount out based on his life expectancy. And now if he passes away, what happens to that? That's what the IRS was trying to deal with, was we had these perpetual IRAs where the money would go in and it would never get taxed. And the IRS is like, we want our tax. So they figured out a way to change the laws so that they get their tax money. And now there is a limitation on how long those can last as an inherited IRA. Yeah.
I would say, pay me now or pay me later. And pay me now is your help to do all of this planning, the cost, as compared to doing it yourself. You know, pay it now, pay it later when I have struggles or whatever the cost. How would you compare those costs of pay me now or pay me later? If you try to do everything yourself and then you miss stuff and then you're not covered because you're not all knowledge like you are.
Well, number one, I'm not all knowledge. Thanks. That was really generous. Yeah, I love what I do, and I've been doing it for about 18 years. It's going to be fairly dependent on the complexity, I think, of your estate and what you're dealing with. I think the other piece of the pay it now versus pay it later is the peace of mind that you have now working with somebody that does have a technical expertise as well as shares your biblical perspective and can give you good, wise counsel that gets it set up the way you want it, the way you think is God's leading you to, and then do it structured in a way that addresses all of those issues those questions that we talked about. I don't know if that answered your question, but okay.
The value of money was more now than more later, or they're equal, or
Oh,
your best efforts on your own. You talked about risk earlier. You create these sort of risks. So that's why I'm trying to, when you're self-taught, self-learning, you just figure out what it is, but you're not all knowing. But
yep.
the company, they're all knowing, and they're going to help you think of things these questions are great, but you're going to help you think of things that will make you consider this.
Yeah, that one for me feeds back to the peace of mind and the value that you place. And that's completely arbitrary. The value you place on the peace of mind that you have that where you're smart enough and the internet allows us to go learn a lot about a lot. Or maybe it's a little bit a lot. But I still rely pretty heavily on partnering with other professionals, CPAs and attorneys, that have a deeper technical expertise than I do because they've spent more time in those technical areas. So I'd love to talk with you more afterwards if you're interested. Yeah.
I have something to offer about that. I don't know if this pertains to you, but I always did my own investments through my life, did all these things, but a few years ago, we partnered with a financial, group because my wife, she has no interest at all in that. So I didn't want to pass away and leave her dealing with guy can do as good a job as paying somebody else a couple percent to handle the money that some people have a hard time dealing with. It's money well spent for the peace of mind for my wife to do that.
Thank you, that's very, yeah, it's where my thinking was going.
So for me, it was a good, I have a little count now I play with. But most, enough for her to meet her needs if something happens to me, it's professionally managed. She doesn't have to worry. I don't know, to me, that's well worth the money.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that because that's, I personally love that opportunity when I get a chance to work with a couple. And actually, one of my business partners, he made that choice, even though he's a financial advisor and could do it himself, but for the sake of his wife, he wanted her not to have to worry about how to manage it all, and chose to go ahead and work with a financial advisor. And it is just a huge privilege to work with widows, and I have quite a few that I get to work with in my practice, and yeah, it's a total privilege, just to free them up, just to go and enjoy life without worrying constantly about the financial stuff that they may just not care about, or not have enough understanding of to really feel good about making good decisions with. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I think I know you shared it the first time, but having a password vault written down all your information for all your places of access is invaluable. Ben shared that with me, and
Yeah.
I constantly work on that to keep it current. The access that's required for all these accounts, because it's difficult even for me to keep up.
Yeah.
Remember it all.
Yeah, if you guys remember from my last time I was here, my wife passed away in August, and that was one of those steps that she and I took that month before she passed away, was to figure out where her passwords were, and make sure that I knew where they were and how to take care of things. Yeah, it's a huge full-time job. I got to have 500 passwords for different things. It's tough to keep up with.
So my parents died a number of years ago, and they had high costs medically before they died, in an adult family home and skilled nursing facility.
Yeah.
And in regard to you're talking about, giving away money to your heirs before you die, what advice do you have on, we got to weigh that with how much money are you going to need? If you go into an adult family home or skilled nursing, you need
Yeah.
$10,000 a month.
Yep. Yeah.
To live there. What advice do you have as far as planning that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard the question, but how do you decide to give money away while still have a risk of you potentially needing a higher cost of care, some kind of adult care facility, nursing care? And that is a tough question. That's one we wrestle with clients all the time. Sometimes you insure it with a long-term care insurance, but that's really expensive, and that industry is really struggling because they underpriced the products for too long, and now they're trying to play catch up. People are living longer, and the cost of care went up. And so how do you balance that, potentially giving to your kids now versus making sure that you have enough? And there isn't a right answer, unfortunately. Andy said that gift that he received from his in-laws, he expects that he's going to be at some point in the future taking care of his in-laws. That maybe they didn't have enough where that gift wasn't going to, eventually they were going to run out. And he sees it as a privilege and a blessing to have that opportunity to take care of them. I ask clients all the time, though, do you want to live with your kids? Show of hands. 1, couple, 3, 4, handful. But most people think, oh gosh, I wouldn't want to be a burden on my kids. And so there is that comes back to the conversation of, yes, here's my estate plan, here's how much I have. I can start to give it to you now, but there may be a risk I need to come move in with you. Are you okay with that? that just may have to be part of the conversation. For some clients, for a lot of clients that we work with, because we do work with some clients that have a higher net worth, that isn't an issue. They have enough for their long-term care needs, as well as being able to be more generous now. But that's not everybody's situation. Yes.
So, going back a little bit here, but, hire companies or hire someone to be, let's say, I'm single, I have a couple of nieces and nephews, but for you, like, to be the executive, if I wanted to take that on the thing,
Mm-hmm.
someone that. So when it comes to like, like, most things I've done, I just done beneficiary, so.
Yeah.
Learning that because I was an executive for my mom.
Mm-hmm.
That was a whole lot easier,
Yes.
because they could just go in and pick out, do whatever they were gonna do, and it's fine. But like when it comes to my home, like my mom's home, I was fortunate, brother and sister that we worked real well together, no problem whatsoever.
Yeah.
But there's just me, so in like my home, if you were to be like the executive of your firm would be, in the distribution of, and I guess the sell of the home, would my heirs, like let's say maybe or use my nephew or my brother-in-law, would they still be able to have some say about the sale of the home and that, or would it just be you would be coming in and just saying, okay, I mean, take what you want, and then we're just gonna sell as it is, and all of that, or, I mean, is there that flexibility, or is it that just a personal conversation? How is that?
So, yeah, that whole process, I don't spend a lot of time in, and we have a trust department that manages that as executors. But we intentionally created went down the road of becoming a trust company, which was huge ordeal, but was so that we had the ability to walk with the beneficiaries in that process and have a relationship with the first generation who's passed, but then also have that relationship with the next generations. And it was, I think it's going to be mostly up to what you include in the will or trust, as to or a letter that you write that says, I want this plate to go to this niece and this vase to go to that niece. And you can get fairly granular in that. And again, writing that stuff down for the stuff that does have value is really important. And that's what it sounded like you were asking, was the stuff in the house.
Well, stuff, just, yeah, that whole sale process.
Yeah.
So I know someone who this happened to, and the firm just kind of came in and they just sold everything inside, cleared it out, sold the house, said, here's your money, and that was it. Never contacted him and said,
Yeah, that's disappointing.
"You're gonna take on," or,
Yeah.
You've got 4 days because we've got, I understand coming in and saying, we've got, we're gonna move on this type of thing, but,
Yeah, I can follow up with you if you'd like and see what our process is for managing that. Whether there is some time for the family to come in and go through the stuff. Again, it's always best if that stuff's written down, that this is who you want to, even if I'd like to have these people come in and have their pick of whatever's here. But if there are certain things that do have more value, then making sure that those are designated to go to certain people. Yeah. Yes.
If you write it on the bottom of a dish, that
Isn't there a form that you fill out and attach it to your will?
That's the ideal way, is if you actually do fill out an inventory. Yeah, and just list the things on the inventory. Yeah, I know. Be nice, just tape it to the bottom, right? Tape their name to the bottom. Yes.
I have an interesting situation. I have 7 children. 3 of them are my late husband's children. So they're like my stepkids. So I made out a will, and I'm kind of old-fashioned. So I am considering, or have considered, a certain percentage of my estate to each of these 7 children.
Mm-hmm.
My 4 and Robert's biological daughter all have the same percentage, the 15%. Okay, the other 2 girls have a lesser amount, and then there's a 10% to the church and all that. Okay, so I have a question about, you said if you have a beneficiary on any of your accounts, that will, does that bypass probate? It does.
It does. Yeah, that actually can be that's a great point. So real quick, the scenario is 7 kids, 3 from late husbands, previous kids, and trying to figure out how to distribute it to each one of the kids. But the issue is that there's assets in the IRA that have a beneficiary and assets that are outside of the IRA, and the will determine where the assets outside of the IRA go. They do not impact
So any other
the IRA.
savings accounts are not considered, they have to go through probate?
Yes.
It's only IRA?
Yeah, you have the option. So there is, again, a form you can fill out that most banks and brokerages have called a transfer on death for an individual account, checking, savings, individual brokerage account. Those ones you can put a beneficiary on as well. Yeah.
So now what about the sale of a house?
That's, I just learned recently that you can actually put a similar document, transfer on death for the value of a house as well.
Listed in your will that the house will be so liquidated and the funds will be distributed to each of the 7. It'd be all kind of like lumped in a big sum or?
Yes. Yeah, so the house would get sold, there would be the proceeds from the sale of the house, and then whatever was there after all of the transaction costs were done and taxes were paid, then would get distributed by the will to those. Yeah. Yep, I know. Yeah, if your beneficiaries don't agree with your will, check that. That's an important step in making sure that everything lines up, because we've had quite a few clients come in and they're IRA says that it goes all to the kids, and they only wanted a limited amount to go to the kids. And now all of a sudden the kids are getting a whole lot more than they anticipated that they were, because the IRA beneficiary says they do, even though the will doesn't. Yes. Yeah.
A few years ago, I went to the state attorney, and after he looked at my assets, he said that all of my assets lie outside of probate except for my house and my car.
Uh-huh.
And he said for the house, I can do a beneficiary deed,
Yep.
which I did myself. I found forms online and I filed it in the county. He said there's nothing like that in Washington State for your car, however. So he said
Yeah.
most people will sell their car, give their car away at some point. So I did everything on my own without a will.
Yep. Yeah, so she's describing, she was able to do everything without a will by putting a beneficiary. The state has a beneficiary form for a house. They don't have a beneficiary form for the stuff in the house or for a car. But for the house itself and the deed on the house, you can actually have a beneficiary for that deed. So there are ways to get around having a will. Again, it's not ideal, but you can, and that'll save you the attorney's costs anyway. Yeah. Yeah, the tricky part then is there still are some assets there. If you can have a simple will that at least gives an executor an ability to go down to the courthouse and file for my wife, I had to fill out a form that says her estate was worth less than a certain amount. It was $100,000, and so it's a small estate affidavit that I had to submit. Fairly easy process, just had to sign it and turn it in, and that was about all I had to do then to be able to transfer her assets into my name. Yes?
What was the small estate?
Small estate affidavit is, I think the limit's $100,000 of individual property. Now, she and I had community property that I was the beneficiary of, but in terms of her individual property, it was less than the $100,000. Yes.
So going to her story regarding the stuff
Mm-hmm.
in the house, in the driveway, could you just write in that additional piece of paper that all the contents take care of that?
Yeah, I still think a will, at least a simple will.
No,
Yeah.
there's a trust.
Okay.
That additional page explains what to do with this stuff.
Yeah, all of the personal property, there isn't a place on a will or a trust to address all of that. There is, but it usually is just divided up. And if people don't want it, then give it away. So yeah, if you can put together an inventory that addresses all the personal property. Again, a lot of that stuff doesn't have a ton of value. We think it has more value than it does.
I have to list all this stuff. I can just say, all my stuff. I give to my children.
Oh, you absolutely can.
Decide
Yes.
To keep, to sell,
Yes.
to donate, and that piece will be taken care of.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. As long as you're not concerned about the kids fighting over it. That's the only reason. That's the reason to list out the inventory. Yeah, just figure out what to do with my stuff, and I don't really care. And as long as you're not fighting about it, then yeah. And if you are fighting about it, then you have to give it away, or I don't know, something. Come up with something creative. Yeah.
Do you have that list, and it goes with that particular item, do you have that list of a particular item that goes to Suzy Q or whatever? This is
Yeah.
the person who-
Yeah, and sometimes that's really important. I worked with a family who granddad had built up quite an estate, and the estate was going to the grandkids. His daughter was getting to use the assets. Within that estate, though, there was some jewelry and some collectibles that had some real value. And fortunately, the grandkids were super neat. The daughter's a missionary in London, and the son's a pastor in Oregon, and they get along great. So they just decided, hey, we don't really, there was a ring in there that was worth $250,000, and they couldn't imagine wearing that anywhere. Yeah, so they took it to Christie's in New York and sold it, and then went out and had a really nice dinner. But yes, they did have some left over. But in those kinds of instances where there is something of significant value, then you want to be intentional about that. Yeah. And that actually would get included then in the estate taxes. The IRS wants to know about that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I was just gonna say that I had a friend whose mom passed away, and she didn't list specific jewelry that had been raised and very expensive, but just had it all mixed in also with her costume jewelry.
Oh, no.
And when the son came in, and he just said, okay, the girls had contract to open mom's clothes, and that, so he said, I can do that. He was going in and doing, did all the clothes, the solid jewelry, gifted it, and it all went to whatever, valuability, goodwill,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yikes.
It wasn't until later when the girls were going, where's mom's, and I guess he probably just got that out back.
Yes, I'm sure he did.
But just, and I just feel like I have some of that kind of stuff with my mom and my grandma. Is that those kinds of things should be listed as a will and kept separate.
Yeah.
Separate from our jewelry that we
Yeah. That's the one thing I forgot to ask my wife. What does she want me to do with her wedding ring? I have 2 daughters, so we'll see. Yeah. Might have to sell it and take the proceeds, split it up or something. I don't know. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for the privilege of being here. Hope this was enjoyable and you learned something and challenged to think well about how to steward the resources God's provided for this life and for the future generations. So thank you again for having me.